My name's Kurt Lanzone. I'm in Park County. I work for Purdue through the Extension Service, and backyard sugaring is something that we do here at our place. Our kids really like doing it and being involved with it. It's been a fun process for them this winter because everybody was ready to get outside and do something with some of the snowstorms we had. So we got a little overzealous and tapped all at once in the snow, and that wasn't exactly normal for us. So it was exciting nonetheless. Just like other people have said, why backyard sugar? I know before a couple came in, I was talking to Karen, and she had talked to people in her Master Gardener Association, that, you can buy that. And yes, you can buy it, but then there's other things, just like anytime we're raising a garden or raising house plants, anything around our properties, we're doing it for something, whether it's recreational purposes, recreational enjoyment. This we can do product quality control. One of the things I like to do, we jar ours in glass. That way you can see all the pretty colors and the cleanliness, not being cloudy of the product and stuff like that. There's actually a study that came out that said, more people appreciate the product being packaged in glass than they do in the plastic containers because they can see the quality and see the product colors and stuff themselves. Would you guys tend to agree that you like, if you did purchase maple syrup, seeing it like that rather than the plastic old school containers?
I'd rather see what I'm buying.
I think that's the way a lot of the stuff is going. I mean, if you look at marketing for a lot of products, not just in maple syrup, they have the way that you can see it. And that helps product sales a lot because, if you produce quality product that looks good, people are going to want to see that, and that's just a marketing tool. A big thing for us is the family involvement. We like doing it together because it gives us family time. And, during this time of year when the weather's not always the best, it gives us a lot to do. Now, like the night before last, when I was up boiling off maple syrup until 1 o'clock in the morning, that wasn't so much family time because everybody else had already went to bed. So that stuff's going to occur as well. If you have another job like I do at Extension, where you can't exactly leave all the time, you got to process syrup and sap when you can. So the other thing is the health benefits, having a product like this versus, a commercially produced pancake syrup that you buy in the store. It is a big difference. And we'll talk about those later on and identify some of those key points as to why it's better to have, a natural product like this. One thing we'll go over real quick, you got to know if you got trees to start with. And I think that's one of the biggest hangups for some people. They see all the trees in their yards and they think, I've got a lot of maple trees. Well, they might not necessarily be the right maple tree. We have a lot of silver maples close to our house, but we won't tap those because of how quick they change to where they have buds. If I look outside right now, along our yard, the silver maples all have their buds, and there'll be a red bud. And I got some videos here from one of the foresters from Purdue to go over identification, because anytime I'm going through identification, I'm going to forget certain things that are key indicators, maybe with one species versus the other, because the main things I worry about when I'm selecting a tree to tap is whether it's a hard maple or not. If it's a hard maple, I want to tap it, whether it's a black or a sugar or a box elder in those families, where I'm not going to tap any soft maples because of how quick the buds turn. Because right now we're getting our biggest push of sap that's coming from the trees. If they were silver maples, I would have already had to pull the taps or the spiles because the buds will give an off flavor to the syrup. It'll have what they call a buddy flavor. And it's almost like a very bitter chocolate kind of taste. And I mean, some people like that, but it's not very common that somebody likes it just because of how bitter it is. So that's why we look for the sugars, the blacks, and the box elders, because they are slower to come in with their buds in the spring. So they'll hold off a little bit more. I looked a while ago, and here in Park County, last couple of days, it's been pretty warm, pretty spring-like. And so far, we still don't have any buds. So as long as the sap's running, we're going to continue to collect. And I'll talk later about the transition of the sap as it goes through the season as it progresses. But let me play this.
Today, we're going to give you some identification characteristics for one of our more common Indiana tree species.
Sound coming through?
Maple. Sugar maple has good shade tolerance, meaning it can regenerate in the shade of other or its own species.
Yeah, we can hear it.
Okay.
That overtop it. That allows it to be a common regenerating species in the understory of our older forests. So it's becoming more common all the time. Sugar maple, like most of the maples, has opposite leaf arrangement, meaning the leaves originate directly opposite each other on the twigs. It has a simple leaf on a relatively long leaf stem, and the leaves are lobed, and normally 5 lobed, 2 smaller lobes at the base and then 3 larger lobes at the top. Sugar maple twigs, as they mature, develop a medium brown color, and the buds are about the same color as the twigs. Sugar maple is famous for producing maple syrup. So it often takes about 40 gallons or more of maple sap to make a gallon of maple syrup in the boiling process. And we can get maple syrup from almost any maple tree, but the yield of sugar maple is one of the highest. The bark on sugar maple is very variable. Typically, it does have a light to medium gray color. It can have some ridging, like this older specimen here that's about 16 inches in diameter. But we can also have relatively smooth bark on seedlings and saplings, and some bark that has crevicing and minor ridges on medium-sized trees. And I have even run into some trees that had bark that were similar to oak and other species. So bark can be somewhat confusing on sugar maple, but be sure to look for that opposite leaf and branch characteristics on the tree, and very deep shade with that large 5-lobed leaf, and that'll help you identify sugar maple. Today we're going to look at a common, but oftentimes not correctly identified tree native here in Indiana. Now, some of you are going to be looking at this and saying, yeah, it's common and we know what it is. This is sugar maple. Well, this is actually black maple. Black maple looks an awfully lot like sugar maple, but there are a couple of different characteristics that will help us identify this tree from its close cousin, sugar maple. First off, black maple will have a tendency to have these little stipules. It's like a little miniature leaf at the base of the large leaves. This is a common characteristic that's held on oftentimes through the summer. And so look at the base of that leaf stem, and if you find that little stipule there, there's a good chance you're looking at black maple, not sugar maple. In sugar maple, these are absent. One of the other characteristics for black maple are mottled gray stems with dark buds. The stems on sugar maple have a tendency to be a medium to dark brown with dark brown buds as well. The bark on black maple is very similar to sugar maple, and we get a lot of variation in these bark patterns, but it's typically a lighter gray color and maybe relatively smooth like this in young trees with flakes or plates in older trees. One of the characteristics of black maple that shows up later in the growing season are large dark leaves that have a tendency to droop at the edges. And so as this tree matures through the summer, we'll typically see a darkening of the leaves, and these broad leaves will have a tendency to droop down at the edges as well. So using the characteristics of the stipules, that mottled gray stem color, and the dark buds, and the dark leaves that droop at the edges, maybe you can impress some of your friends by differentiating between sugar maple and black maple.
Here's one of the softs and one of the ones I was talking about earlier that really change over quick with their buds.
Today, we're going to give you some identification characteristics for silver maple. We have several species of maple native in Indiana, and in some cases, they can be a little bit confusing in terms of identities of which species is which. Silver maple is one of our soft maples, meaning that it sheds its seed relatively early in the season. And so it, along with red maple, will be one of the first species to put flowers out in the spring, and will mature its wing seed sometime typically in mid to late May. Our hard maples will typically flower later in the growing season, and their seed matures in the fall. Silver maple is a tree that is most commonly found in floodplain or other moist to wet areas, although it will grow in a variety of locations and is one of our faster growing trees here in Indiana. As with almost all the maples, it has opposite leaf arrangement. And so the leaves are held directly opposite each other on the twigs. It has relatively long leaf stems and simple leaves. And in the case of silver maple, the leaves are typically 5-lobed and have very deep divisions called sinuses between the lobes. If we flip this leaf over, we can see where it gets its name. It has a very silvery green underside color, which is really prominent when the wind's blowing. These trees will turn almost completely silver as those leaves turn over in the wind. The tree typically, as a young tree, has relatively smooth gray bark that's similar to many of the other maples. As an older tree, the bark will typically be a little bit darker and divided into large, rough, flaky plates. Silver maple has historically been used for street trees in many cases. However, it may not be always the best choice for that, in that it tends to have weaker wood and does grow very quickly and gets to be a very large tree. One of the great characteristics for identifying this particular maple from the others is the very deeply divided lobed leaves and the fact that it is a soft maple producing its seed early in the spring, and it has a very large winged seed. We can make maple syrup from the sap of silver maple. However, it oftentimes does not produce nearly as much sugar per gallon of sap as sugar maple does. Today we're going to give you some identification characteristics for one of our Indiana maples, red maple. Red maple is a very popular selection for ornamental plantings in yards and for street trees, but it also is native to our Indiana woodlands, and we typically find it growing both on moist and also dry sites. It is a well-named species in that oftentimes in the fall, the foliage has a very beautiful red to maroon color, and in the spring, the flowers that come out very early in the spring will typically be a reddish color, as will sometimes the early developing winged fruit. This is a soft maple, meaning it does produce its fruit and seeds very early in the summer, and is one of the first plants in terms of our native trees to flower in the spring. Our hard maples will have a tendency to flower later in the season, and their fruit ripens in the fall. Red maple has 3 to 5 lobed leaves with relatively shallow divisions between the lobes, or also called sinuses, and they are prominently V-shaped. This leaf can look a little bit like sugar maple, but the V shape on the sinuses differentiates it from the U shape that we find on sugar maple. As in all the maples, the leaf arrangement on red maple is opposite, with relatively long leaf stems. The bark on young trees is gray and smooth, as is typical for many of the maples. On older trees, it may get a more of a flaky appearance. And we can find this tree both in bottomlands, but also in upland sites, where it can be an understory tree in a variety of different hardwood forests. It is a popular tree for shade and ornamental purposes in the fact that it does have great fall color, and it can be used for producing maple syrup. However, the sugar yield per gallon of sap oftentimes is not as high as what we've got with sugar maple. On this edition of ID That Tree, we're going to introduce you to an Indiana maple species that may not suggest maple to you when you see the leaves, and that is box elder. And in fact, even the name suggests some folks decided maybe it didn't really belong in the maple group, but in fact, it is a member of our maple family here in Indiana. Box elder has opposite leaf arrangement, just like all of our other native Indiana maples. What sets it apart are these compound leaves, and so box elder typically has 3 to 5 leaflets. And in fact, the 3 leaflet leaves can make a little bit of a suggestion of poison ivy. But remember, poison ivy has alternate leaf arrangement, and as a vine, typically, box elder, tree size, opposite leaf arrangement. Another good identification characteristic for box elder are these green twigs. And so this can be a bright kind of Kelly green or more of an olive green in color, but very typical for the species and not found on any of other native Indiana maples. Box elder bark, as you can see, is kind of a medium gray in color, long running, relatively flattened ridges up and down. And this species is actually in flower right now. As you can see, not a particularly showy flower, long strands holding the pollen, relatively green to yellow-green in color, and could even be missed if we're not looking closely. And that's oftentimes the case with many of our hardwood species. It may not have showy flowers, but they're flowering nonetheless to produce that fruit that reproduces the species. And as in the maples, this will ultimately produce a paired wing seed that we recognize floating across the landscape to reseed our maples. So box elder, fairly common denizen of some of our bottomland forest areas and wet and moist sites, and one of our native Indiana maples, but the only one with compound leaves.
Any questions on that? Everybody think they can identify their hard maples now in their woodlots and yards?
I think we can. Now I'm questioning whether we have sugar maples or red maples, but
Well, you'll be able to tell this fall for sure.
yeah, I can tell that. Well, the ones we have are really beautiful in the fall. Lots of color change. So I'm thinking that they might be red maples.
Typically in the fall, the sugars and blacks will have like a goldish color leaf. It'll be a real bright color, like an orange.
We definitely got one of those then. We definitely have one. It doesn't really go orange or red. It goes like bright yellow.
The other thing you could probably tell right now, you're in Brownsburg. So if it's got buds starting to show, and they're red, and it had red leaves last fall, it's probably a red maple.
Okay.
If it's a silver maple, they'll have like they are the nastiest looking leaves when they turn. They'll be like a lighter green to beige color when they start turning, and then they'll have just like a nasty yellow. I mean, no brilliance, no brightness to them. They just.
I don't think we have those. I think.
Okay.
Now that you're saying this, I think we may have a mix of sugar and red.
And that's okay. You just have, the reds do have a longer set than what the silvers do, so they can be tapped, but just like what he said in that review, they don't have as high a sugar content. So that's just one thing to take in consideration, but just watch the buds for those to be changing. And when those change, that's when you're pretty much done pulling sap from those.
Okay. Got it.
We have black and sugars in our woods behind our house that we tap. So I have reds that I could tap, but we have enough black maples and sugar maples that I don't mess with them. Last year we did about 15 to 20 taps. I can't remember off the top of my head. And this year we're over 60. So there's plenty there, and we could tap more, but trust me, my hands have been full. So my boys are tired of pulling sap. You'll see plenty of pictures of them because they've been pretty well into it.
Good.
A big question that a lot of people have, what exactly makes it flow? Everybody thinks, the nice warm weather last week or last couple days, really makes it flow good. And yes, to some extent, but if you recall, a couple weeks ago, we had some really warm days and it didn't flow. I mean, it was like no draw whatsoever. And that's because the roots were still frozen. And when the soil's still frozen hard and the roots are frozen, there's no way for that moisture to enter the roots. Because what happens at night as the gases in the tree itself freeze, they constrict. So that then takes that atmospheric pressure and pulls that negative pressure. So it pulls water up through. Well, then as the day warms up, those gases expand again. And that puts pressure on the fluid in the tree. And after you've put a hole in it with a spout or spile, that gives a place for that moisture to come back out. So that's the gist of how it actually happens. And, we can have days that you would think that it would just run tremendously. And it doesn't do anything because the roots are still frozen, like what happened a couple weeks ago here. Or it's been warm too long where there wasn't a freeze cycle. So just this past week here at our place, we've had several good days of running. And then yesterday, they pretty much almost stopped compared to the day before. Now tonight, I don't know if it'll get cold enough to where it's going to freeze some of that wood. I think we're supposed to be like 28 degrees here. So we're close. Probably depends how much wind we get that way, creates some cooling through the branches and stuff. We could see another little push, and I'm excited to see if it does because I think this weekend we could be busy processing sap again here at our place. Everybody always asks me, when's it time to tap? Here in Indiana, we have a lot of changes in our seasons as to when they start and when they end. And that can really dictate how soon we tap and how late we let it go. Last year, I tapped really, really early. I tapped in January, which this diagram here is from Cornell, from a research project that they had. They do a lot of research with maple sap. But when you tap early, and if you have a couple decent days where everything thaws out and they run, that sap can be some of the cleanest, like most purest looking sap that you'll ever see. When you process it, turn it into syrup will be some of the cleanest syrup that you've ever processed. And it's really cool to see how the change as we go through the season. But ultimately, it don't matter when we tap the tree to get those different runs. We call them runs. That's when it pushes, the sap heavily out through. It won't ultimately affect the amount that we see over the season. As you can see here in this diagram, these were in New York, which they're about a month probably behind us usually for tapping. And they tapped some in January and let them go the whole season. And then they tapped some in February, let them go the whole season. Then they tapped some in March and let them go the whole season. And as we get further into some of the research projects, trees are really hard to research. You'll find that when they do get some good data, basically that hole or that tap or that tree is going to give what it's going to give, no matter when it was tapped or not. So if you had somebody that, one of our maple producers here in Park County just tapped his trees last week, and he's going to still yield as much, probably more than what he did last year, because everything last year turned to buddy really early. So the season was really short because the days got too warm, like what we could see, next week in the forecast. But the ultimate thing I'm wanting to say is you tap when you want to tap or when you have time available in order to catch runs. If you see the forecast is going to change to where you're going to have some of those days where you think the sap might run, I would probably get them tapped. Like we see now, the weather is going to change to where it's really warm and some of these trees might start budding. So they might have the chance to make it to where we don't have sap that we can harvest that's usable. We talk about equipment for tapping. We got to have some sort of drill to drill the hole that we put the spile or spout in. Each one of those spiles or spouts are different sizes, and we need to select the appropriate size bit for that. You'll see a lot of different advertisements in some of these producer magazines, selling bits with the spiles and stuff, and that's okay to purchase as well. They're just trying to help make sure that you get the right spout or spile drill bit. We're going to need some sort of hammer, a dead blow hammer or a soft end hammer works pretty good because a lot of the spouts or spiles are plastic now. So the steel traditional hammers can take a pretty good impact on it. Probably one of my favorites that I see is the old school leather mallets. I don't know if you guys have seen those, but those are hard to find sometimes, but they're lighter weight to carry and do a pretty good job. We talk about some of the supplies that we need, and there is so many options for doing our backyards like what we do that the possibilities are endless. I mean, if you have some kind of food grade container that can catch and hold something, then you can pretty much use it. I mean, we can use a gallon milk jug on the side of a tree hanging from a spout. Can use just about anything that will hold the product. Things that work better are things that are sealed. That way there's less chance of intrusion from bugs and things of that nature, because the bugs are starting to affect what we do. So we're having to strain everything even more so than what we did before as the weather warms up. Another option that's really been pushed out is the tubing, because it's easy to just drop that tubing down and put it in a bucket. We talk about the spile or spouts. There's a lot of different options. Traditionally, prior to the 60s and 70s, everything was aluminum or stainless products for the most part, and they used a lot of 7/16 sized spiles or spouts. And it was believed that those would help increase flow because a bigger orifice, more stuff flows through. That was the gist of that. They would drill those, set them in, use those to move more sap, they thought. Things that we found out through research is that 5/16 spouts do pretty good. They have a smaller hole that you drill into the tree, so they set in easier. Not as much energy required to drill a 5/16 hole as a 7/16 hole. The big advantage is the tree heals quicker when it's repairing after you've pulled the taps. So we've tapped with both on our place just to see comparisons and the benefits of having the 5/16 and how quick they heal. I almost can't notice the hole that we drilled last year, where the 7/16 I can still see it pretty well on a lot of our trees. Another one that we tried this year at our place is a 3/16 spout, and it goes to a 5/16 hose, so it has the same size barb fitting, but it's only 3/16 that's going into the tree. And I'm curious to see what we see for the health of the tree afterwards, because that's one of the big things. I want my kids and grandkids, if they want to be around here, be able to use this place, be able to use those trees as well. And I'm curious to see how much quicker the healing is on those. I can tell you from a standpoint of flow out of the tree, I have not noticed any difference in collection of sap between the 3/16, 5/16, 7/16 spouts. They're all pretty close in production. The only thing that I see that varies ours is where they are in elevation. We have 3 valleys behind our house that all the trees are in. And the only thing that seems to vary the amount of sap that we have on a very collection is where it's at on the hillside or in the valley. And that's been the most interesting part over last year or this past spring, is what trees produce this day versus what trees produce the next day. And that's been pretty exciting. Talking about collection options a while ago, we do 3 different styles here at our place. This is from one of our friends on the right here with the water jugs, and that's an excellent way to do it too. I had never thought of it before, but after she said something about that, I think it's awesome, because then it's also, if you have a spare one, you carry it with you and you just swap it out. The hangers were used forever, which you can see in the middle picture, and those will hang on a metal spout, whether it's aluminum or stainless, and they can be 7/16 or 5/16. The disadvantage to that is the cost. The metal frame hangers themselves are $3 to $5 a piece, and the bags themselves, I think they're running about 50 cents, and they can hold about 4 gallons of product in them. They are easy to dump. It's got a handle there that you carry it to your bucket or your wagon vessel or whatever you've got, and you just pull one corner of the bag and tip it up, and it flows out. The option on the left is a new option that I tried this year that a buddy turned me on to. It is a wine fermentation bag. So it's not meant for sap collection typically, but it works really well from what we found. It can hang right on the spile or spout itself and stay on, because it's got a similar hard plastic with a cap on it there. So you could put a cap on it and load those all in the back of a wheelbarrow or a yard cart or whatever you want to haul it back to your sugar house with, or your garage, and store it like that in your refrigerator or, in a secure place. The kids love these because it's like the water container on the right where they can see the water dripping in. And it's pretty exciting to them when they come up to the woods and they can see the water dripping in, because it's more visual. The big advantage to those, I can do the bag and the tap that goes with it for under $1 a piece. So that's a pretty good advantage. Like you've seen on the slide before, plastic spouts aren't very expensive. The max flows there, 20 cents, that's pretty cheap for a max flow. When you start talking about the metal ones, that's where you get into expenses. The tubing itself, I think a 50-foot roll runs to where it's like 50 cents a foot for the tubing itself. So it's not too bad. You don't have to have a whole lot for each spile that you're running off or spout, because usually your vessel's pretty close. If you can see here on the right, we got a little bit extra, but that's because using one container for 2 trees, which with a 6-gallon container like that, that's absolutely fine, because it takes a pretty good run to where you're going to collect 6 gallons of sap very quickly. One of the big things we talk about is what size tree to tap. You'll see some commercial producers that will basically tap about any maple tree in their woods, and that's probably not the best idea. And if we look at some of the information from some of our other institutions, they come out and say minimum of 10 inches for a single spout or spile. When we get over that 18 inches, that's when we can start adding multiples. And then 25, we can do up to 3. You'll also see some commercial producers that will have, 30-inch plus trees, and they will add spouts or spiles incrementally. I could not find any data from any of the land grant institutions that said anything more than 3. So even if it's a very large maple tree, the most that I seen from any of their data was 3. So that's what we're going to talk about, is just having 3 or less. Easy way to do that. Just have a tape measure. You're just trying to eye the diameter, and you're wanting to do it about chest high, and just hold that tape measure out and arm's length, and look down one side of the tape measure and line up the edge of the bark with it on the left with the end of the tape, and then sight the right side and see about where it is. And that's going to give you a good estimation as to what the diameter of the tree is. The other option you can do, if you have a lot of smaller trees, it's really easy, is you can have a piece of rope that would be 10 times pi, 3.14, so 31 inches or so, and mark it. And as long as you measure that around, and it's bigger than that circumference wise, then you have a tree that you can tap. I just take tape measure because it's easy to go up in the woods, because most of ours we're looking, whether I could put 2 or 3 or, spouts in it. So I'm trying to get an idea what size, and I'm not going to try and put a rope around some of these trees because can't even put my arms around them. So grabbing the other end of the rope sometimes can be difficult. Tapping depth, always a question. An angle. You'll see information that comes out now online from all kinds of places saying you got to tap at an angle. You don't tap at an angle. You can tap flat when you drill your holes. It needs to have a little bit of an angle because that's going to help it overcome and use gravity to help pull it with that pressure out of the spout, because it still has a hole in the spout that has to be forced out through. So if you put it at a slight angle, it's going to be able to drip out easier. Does it help with your vacuum or anything like that with you pulling if you've got tubing running into a container? No. The guys that are running, or producers that are running vacuum lines, they can run straight in because they're putting vacuum pressure on the lines, and that's going to help suck the sap through that spout. And so it doesn't matter if they have an angle or not. Tapping depth, when we're talking about tapping depth, we want to be about 1.5 inches, 2 inches with the 5/16 taps, and the 7/16, since they're a little bit larger, we want to take those to about 2.5 inches on the depth of those. And there's a lot of data that supports the depth of that. A lot of times, older folks would drill in some of these maple groves, 3 inches depth, and think that they were going to get more sap out because they were drilling to a deeper depth, and that's just not the case. Equipment for collection, being able to move it or store it is always important. So make sure you're using some sort of food grade containers. There's a lot of different options for that. And it's just using your imagination, what you can come up with the best solution. One thing that always comes up this time of year as we get towards the end of season, I know there's a lot of questions on keeping the sap fresh. You want to try and process it as fast as you can when it's warmer like this, but if we can keep it in that 40-degree range, we slow the bacteria growth. And why does bacteria matter if I'm going to boil it to be 212 plus degrees? Any ideas? Tanya, I've talked to you about storing. Why do you think it's important to keep it cooler and limit bacteria growth?
Austin says he thinks it's because bacteria eats the sugar.
That's exactly right. And when
Oh.
it eats the sugar, what does it do?
It's like gaining energy and letting it like produce more of its own like bacteria and stuff like that.
So one thing that happens, it eats that sugar. So if it's eating the sugar, that means you have to boil more sap to make more syrup, because your sugar content will actually go down as we get further in the season. The other thing is, as these bacteria eat and die from you boiling them, it'll help make the colors richer as well as we go through the season. So this was early season stuff, and this was yesterday. So you can kind of see, the differences. And a lot of that's from the aging of that sap and it being warmer. It gets to a point where there's too much bacteria in there and it gets cloudy. That means it's converted a lot of your sugars already, and that cloudiness is meaning that you're not going to have much sugar concentration, and it's also going to be a darker product, and it can sometimes have an off flavor. One of the telltales is to smell it, and if it has a sour smell to it, just go ahead and pitch it. Because if you have one container off of one tree that's like that, you don't want to add that into your good sap and have like 2 gallons that ruins 40 gallons of sap. Another option is that I've seen that works really well to store it in is coolers. Large coolers, we see a lot of those at the Walmarts and stuff, and if those have been sanitized appropriately and cleaned, those can store it. The other thing is having a gallon ice cream jug or some of the smaller quart jugs, filling those with sap themselves from a day before or earlier in harvest, and just having them in the freezer sitting there ready to throw in, because as those thaw out in the sap itself, it'll help cool it down and keep the sap to where it's more viable. Any questions, guys? So, Jones Rule of 86. I struggled whether to go over this because a lot of people don't have a refractometer or a sap hydrometer to go over this and to check. And number one, it's not an expensive tool to have. The big thing it helps you do, if you have other things that you got to do, it helps you estimate how long you're going to have, boiling your sap, or, knowing how much storage you're going to have with finished product, how many jars. It'll help you determine things like that as you're going down the road. Typically we see early in our seasons here, the early sap is very light on sugar content. The mid-range stuff, like we're just finishing up now, it's probably the best sugar content. And then as we go further in the season, we get less sugar content that we have as a finished product to finish. And Austin hit it perfectly as to why, the further we go down this season, some of our sugar content drops. Number one, that bacteria is more active. It's eating the sugars itself. The warmer weather comes, so the exchange between the trees up and down with the sugar content from storage, and conversion from starches is less as well. But it is an option to have. I don't have one because I'm going to boil it anyway. I know we don't do a whole lot of big batches, so we pretty much have enough storage in jars for us for stuff here. But early in the season, it'd been nice to have to know, how long I was going to be sitting out there at the cooker. The nice thing about early in the season, you can store it and store it and store it. And I've had containers freeze out there, outside, and you can wait until the weekend to process it when you've got plenty of time. Something that some people will invest in to cut down on their evaporation times is a hobby-sized reverse osmosis kit, and it's referred to as RO, just reverse osmosis RO. And what it does, you run your whole sap through this, and it will discharge wastewater, basically, which is pretty pure water, and then it'll save the sugared water and separate it. And it will cut your boiling time down about 2/3 with this system. The nice thing about the system, you can set it up on containers, and this size right here, it's about $300. It will have a set amount of liquid that it can process per hour because it has a pump on it. And if it has this amount to process and you have this amount in the container, you can set it up before you go to bed and get up in the morning and it'll be done. It's a lot different than our evaporators, because I can't set my evaporator up and start it before I go to bed and get up the next morning and expect to have, nearly finished syrup, because of the process of watching it to make sure it doesn't boil over, and, some other things we'll go over here in a minute. But it's a really cool product. After the last couple late nights, I would go buy one like right now, but my wife doesn't exactly agree with that. So we'll see what the next year brings. One thing we have to consider when we're collecting all our sap or tapping how many trees we're doing is, what size evaporator pan am I going to use? How much product am I going to have to evaporate off? If we're talking about an average set of taps, overnight we're going to collect a gallon off of that, and I know the next day I got to boil a certain amount, because I don't have any more storage, which is the situation I ran into. We ran out of storage, so I had to stay up and boil to get rid of product or make product. I need to size my pan right, or size my storage right. And a lot of that dictates, what size pan you're going to use at your house. And just keep a table like this in mind. And if you guys need some resources after this, I can send them out to you. I've got a lot of resources, how to do things with this. But I think it's important to have the right size pan, because if we don't have enough sap to process through it, we're wasting energy. The other thing is, do I have a big enough pan? We run, a 2x4 pan, which most of the time is pretty good for what we got. But if we get a run like what we had this week, and I was just, let's just say I was shocked, because I never envisioned that we would have as much sap as what we did to mess with as what we did this week. There's a lot of different options for when we do evaporators. They can be from very large. You can see the evaporator on the bottom. That's from a commercial producer that still fires on wood. I think he said it was 3x9 for that. So it's moving a lot of evaporation rate. It's got the channels, where it's circling through and then giving you a finished product out the one side with the spout. That system's really cool. But where I started was, the one there at the top where you're boiling, basically over a cinder block set over your fireplace and just keep feeding it with wood, and, trying to keep the wind down so that way you get an even boil. And the other option is, a turkey fryer that you see there. If you don't have a lot of sap to process, that can be an economical option as well, rather than investing in, pans and, blocks and fire bricks and, wood fuel and all that to run. So I've made some different changes in what we do, and ours currently is the one on the right there, the oil tank that we converted to fit a 2x4 boiler on. One thing we got to talk about is the evaporation process itself. We need to know what the boiling temperature of water is, and atmospheric pressure around us can affect that from day to day. And so if we have that digital thermometer, we need to make sure it's 212 degrees. And then we know our finished sap temperature will be about 7.5 degrees over that. So if we don't have hydrometers and things like that to make sure it's finished in the end, we're just going to take that sap all the way to 219 degrees. And when it hits that, we know we got finished syrup. So if you're doing this at home in your backyard, candy thermometers work really well. There's some that have the sliding rule, and those can be harder to find. You got to look to source those, and you set the boiling temperature on there as you start up your maple water burning or boiling. You set that when it starts boiling, you set that, and that way it's your scale for the rest of the time. Because when it gets to that temperature where it's close to being finished, we pull everything off of the wood and we will finish it inside on the stove or on the turkey fryers, where we can control the heat, because it can change pretty quick when it gets up there in that temperature range where it's getting close to being done. And you can end up with some charcoal product in a pan pretty quick. The other thing, as it gets towards the end of that, your burner isn't going to have to be as high, because it's not going to take as much heat energy to boil off that steam. So our turkey fryer actually can't finish all the way on, because it puts out too much heat even on low to where you can finish something. You have to finish it on the stove. So that way you can control the heat even lower, because if you leave the heat on the lowest setting on the turkey fryer, it'll boil over the pan, even when it's, 2 inches deep in the pan. Just some tips. Keep the heat high as long as we can. I mean, we feed it whatever fuel source we're using. Ours, we use totally wood to boil off the majority of the sap, and that's because it's the right price for us. We've got the price of processing the wood itself. We have plenty of woods to take care of that, so we go up and split stuff, have it drying, and have it ready to go when it comes time. One thing that we do is choose good wood to burn in our evaporator. We choose locust for ours and a lot of the other hardwoods because they hold more BTUs to convert that sap towards the syrup ending process. We don't want to use lighter woods like maple, soft maples, pines, yellow poplar, stuff like that. It just doesn't have a good heating value. And you'll just be feeding the fire the whole time. One thing to notice, the boys think it's very exciting because they are bored out of their minds, as this is not a quick process. Don't stir it. We just skim foam off the top. If you agitate it more, it leads to the more buildup of sugar sands. The more you agitate it as it's boiling. The best thing that I can give advice-wise is boil with a couple inches in any pan, 2 to 3 inches, usually about halfway up as a max of whatever pan you're using. And then as it reduces, you're going to add sap constantly, but you want to add it to where you don't kill the boil. You don't want to kill off all your heat. That's why a lot of these pans, the hobby size pans, have these warming pans above them like you see here, and it's got a valve on it, because I can crack that valve and it can have, you know, a 1/4 inch stream that just trickles into the pan to replace what is boiling off. And then I can fill the warming pan, you know, gallons at a time. And that works really well to speed up, you know, processing and help keep your boil going. And it makes it easier on you to where you don't have to be there, you know, every 5 minutes. You can walk away and go take care of some things if you need to. As we get closer to the syrup being finished, we're going to pull it off. And when we pull it off, we're going to run it through a filter, just a simple fiber filter, cone filter. That way it helps remove some of that sugar sand and impurities to begin with. You can see there on the right, there's some little black specks in there, and that's some of the sugar sand and niter that's come off from the boiling process. We pull ours, you know, about 217, 218 degrees off of that, because I can't control temperature on that wood evaporator. So I want to make sure I don't burn it. So I pull it off. And if it costs me a little bit of extra time boiling on the stove or the turkey fryer, then so be it. When we do process this, we want to take it all the way to 66 or 67 Brix. And somebody look at you and go, what are you talking about? Well, Brix is the amount of sugar solution in the water. And the easiest way to do that's with a hydrometer. Now, if you don't have a hydrometer, just make sure you take it to 219 degrees, 219 and a half degrees. And it will become a sheeting liquid off of your spoon from your finishing pan. And as it's sheeting off of that spoon, you know it's pretty close to being done. I will say that if you do finish it with just thermometer only, I would make sure I stored it inside refrigerator or freeze it, because you don't know for sure what the sugar content is, and the sugar content is what makes it a safe product for storage in jars and, you know, other sterilized containers. But when we look at this, I can see right here, I've got 2 red lines. The bottom red line is what I'm checking the Brix after it's cooled to room temperature. So after I've jarred some, I will save some out, and I will do this test on it once it gets down to 60 degrees. The other thing, as I am finishing processing on the boiling, it has a hot test line. So they've calculated what it should be when the liquid is hot, because the liquid is more viscous when it's hot, and it's 59 Brix when it's at 211 degrees. So what's the problem if it's 211 degrees? If I'm boiling to around 219 and a half degrees, I got to let it cool off a little bit before I test it. So you pull the cup, and then you'll let it cool a little bit, and then you'll test it. So you got to try and maintain that syrup temperature in the reduction pot as you're cooling it. So if you're going to do any and store it in jars or any kind of syrup container, I'd recommend getting one of these. I think I paid $15 for this. And then you can get any kind of cylinder you want that's food grade to use with it. I think the most expensive part of that was the cylinder itself, because it's stainless and everything metal wise has gone through the roof. We talked about filtering. These are really common to get. Have the 2 pre-filters. Used to be wool for the heavy finishing filter. Now they're pretty much synthetic. They are washable in your kitchen sink. Just make sure you don't use any soap with them or anything. You're just going to triple rinse stuff and clean it that way. Hot water. Most of our hot water at our houses have enough chlorine through the system that it's going to help sanitize it because of the chlorine content for that by the time you triple rinse it. The other option, if I don't want to spend the money on a filtering system, is using what they call the settling method. So I can get a larger jar or container and pour the syrup in there and let it settle in the refrigerator. Just set it in there and you'll watch everything start to stratify over the 24 hours, and it'll start to settle, and then all your sugar sand will be in the bottom. And then you can siphon or pour off most of the good syrup from that, and then you'll have that to where you can process it for storage. Some people just put everything in the jars, let the sugar sand and everything go in there. Sugar sand is not going to make it bad per se. It's just not as appealing to look at. So that's the people's preference. If they're just going to use it for them and their family, and they just know that, don't eat the sugar sand at the end because it's not really sugar, just sit there and, spoon it off as they're eating. And then at the end, they just have that to throw away. A lot of commercial operations will have a pretty expensive filter press, and they will add filtering material with it and pump it through there. That way it gets, everything out. All this stuff that we do here at our house is done with the pre-filters and the finishing filter. 2 pre-filters is good because you could pull one pre-filter out while it's still got stuff in it and just dump it in the next one, and then wash it and swap them back out. So if you're doing, quite a bit of syrup, it can be an effective tool. Measuring sugar content, we talked about it a while ago. The hydrometer and cup is an easy way. We can use temperature to do it because we know, it's going to be at 66 bricks when we get to that 219.5 degrees. The big chance is not knowing exactly what our boiling point was and 7.5 degrees above that. As long as we know those numbers, it should be safe, but that's always, something we have to watch. The other thing is a refractometer. That's an instrument that can be used really quickly. You put a drop of syrup on it and it'll give you a range that you sight through and tell what the sugar content is. Packing a syrup, in order for it to be safe, everything needs to be hot packed. So it needs to be at least 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Need to have sterile lids and sterile jars. And to sterilize those, the easiest way is to put them in boiling water for over 10 minutes, and that's going to take care of everything. As we're getting ready to package our syrup, if we ran it through our filter and it's taken a while to filter through, we might have to reheat it. Now, if we reheat it, we don't want to reheat it, number one, too fast, or we don't want to exceed 200 degrees. Because if we do, it can cause that sugar sand again, which you just spent all that time filtering to get out, come back, because it'll build more. And one thing about selecting container, mention that the plastic containers don't keep as long. They're good for 3 to 6 months because they do let some exchange between the outside atmospheric air and the product itself. So they're only going to keep about 3 to 6 months, where glass containers can be over a year. The other thing is, they're a lot prettier to look at than the plastic, like we talked about at the beginning. The other thing is what's easy for you to get a hold of. There's a few sugar camps that have supplies that they sell as well, and that's where you can go and buy some of the plastic jugs if that's what you wanted, or some of the fancy ornate maple leaf glass things. But I can go to basically any hardware in town, or some grocery stores, or even probably Dollar Generals, and get jars to use to package product in that's going to keep for good shelf stable time. Anytime we question whether it's good or not, or we don't have a seal, we can put those in the refrigerator and just use them within the next 30 days, and everything should be good there. One thing that a lot of people talk about is the different colors of syrup. Different grades used to come into play a lot, but USDA's changed at the request of Vermont, I believe it was, to change the grading. And basically, everything grade A is anything that's clear. So as long as it doesn't have no sediment and no particles in it, it's considered a grade A syrup. The only difference is the colors, and some places differentiate their product on colors because of how hard it is to get a certain color or not. The golden color that you see there, and even our early stuff, is close, but it's not quite golden color. It's probably a mix between golden and amber. And then it's very early syrup or sap collection. It was taken off the trees very early. There usually isn't a lot of it. It's from those early runs that people tap from to make that golden syrup. And it'll have a very delicate flavor. The sugar content it's all just as sweet. The only difference is the finish of the maple flavor in your mouth. This one's probably a cross between an amber and a dark. It's probably in between there. They do have where you can tell how much light passes through it, and that'll tell you what one it is exactly, because it'll give you a percentage. And that'll tell you whether it's amber or dark for sure, but it's pretty close either way. Both of those are typical of Indiana, middle of the run or earlier run syrup. And then as we go further through the season, because of that bacteria and stuff, it's going to make that darker syrup that we see there on the right. And I'd suspect that's what we'll see some ran from some of the sap we collect off trees this weekend. And I would say this weekend we'll probably be close to being done as we get this darker color, that gets towards the end. And it's got a very strong flavor because it's almost right there getting ready to be at that almost buddy flavor. Anything we do, gardening, life skills, anything we want to talk about is something safety. Doing these, we want to make sure we use appropriate clothing for the weather. You've seen earlier in one of those early pictures, one of my sons in bib overalls and winter boots and all that because there was snow on the ground and it was cold. Always wear gloves. If you're messing around with the trees with the drills and throwing shavings, safety glasses are a good idea. We're dealing with heat sources and fuel. Make sure you keep a fire extinguisher around, because that's kind of important if something gets away from you. So final checklist. I'll launch some polls for you as I go over the final checklist. Need to find healthy maple trees. We need to have something to collect the sap in. We got to have something to take the sap to the storage containers or stored in, you know, spouts or spiles, drill bits, some sort of hammer to tap them in. Thermometer at a bare minimum, like a decent thermometer. That way you can watch where your boiling points are and stuff. Evaporation equipment of some sort, whether it just be, you know, a stainless pan from your kitchen, or even, you know, we get to some of the fancy arches, you know, that run off of fuel oil. Need to have some kind of fuel for the evaporator, whether it be wood, you know, your stove in the house. We got to have some kind of filtering or large jars so we can reduce some of that sugar sand. And then always, you know, safety equipment. One more poll. If you guys have got any questions, feel free to ask.